Well, I think we could start. Yes. Hello, dear colleagues. I'm really happy to meet Professor Smith and Professor Waterman. I do hope that you could hear and see me. It's really a great privilege and honor to welcome you Lomonosov Moscow University. We are really delighted to join by Professor Smith. He's professor at Chapman University, and of course he doesn't need any introduction. He's a Nobel Prize winner for his wonderful works in experimental economics. Professor Smith, we couldn't be happier to have you on. So thank you very much for making the time, and I think I suggest we get started. Yes, please, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Alexander and I'm sure his many assistants for making this conference possible. I'm happy to see a great many of my friends who have registered to give talks at this conference, and many more who I do not know, but their topics look very intriguing. So I'm very happy to be here. This talk is about what I call Adam Smith's theory of society. And that theory is developed mostly in his first published book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But portions of it also can appear in his lectures on jurisprudence, and in my writings, I sometimes cite passages from his lectures on jurisprudence. Well, I want to begin with the question of how Smith conveys the idea of our essentially social nature. He does this by asking us to imagine a member of the human species growing up to maturity without ever having any contact with another member of the species. He says that person can no more have an idea of what it means for his mind to be deformed than for his face to be deformed. And then he goes on to say, bring that person into society and you give him the mirror that he lacked before. And so he uses this metaphor of a social mirror to convey the idea of how we know ourselves. We learn of ourselves through others. And that process, he believes, begins in earnest when we first have playmates. Of course, it begins earlier than that, but he feels that it's particularly significant. That influence becomes particularly significant once we have playfellows. That's when we enter what he calls the great school of self-command. And in Adam Smith's idea that humans are followers and creators of rules that we all adhere to, it's that process which constitutes our socialization, and it's kind of a bottom-up theory of society. Society comes from ordinary people like you, me, and our neighbors in antiquity, learning to live with each other, to get along with each other. And he asserts that we are all strictly self-interested. That sounds like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction, because Adam Smith, unlike most modern scholars, made a distinction between being self-interested and acting in your self-interested interest. He did not see these as the same thing. We were all self-interested, but in order to get along with our neighbors, we learn sort of other regarding ways to take into account the interest and preferences and happiness of others. So that distinction between being self-interested and acting self-interestedly is very important. He says, he asserts we're all self-interested, but you can't look humankind in the face and assert that all of your decisions will be made in your strict self-interest. So, as a consequence, we humble the arrogance of our self-love to bring it down to what other people can go along with. And that phrase, go along with, or not go along with, that phrase appears some 40-odd times in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He wants you to get that phrase. He wants you to understand the importance of that to his way of thinking. And that distinguishes him from the utilitarians of the day, like David Hume, and also, I think, modern utilitarians. And it's a distinction that I think is particularly prominent in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but it actually carries over to the Wealth of Nations. For example, in the Wealth of Nations, there's the famous quotation in which Adam says that every person, so long as he does not violate the laws of justice, should feel perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way. Now, phrases like own interest and own way, I think it's difficult to understand completely if you haven't read the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Own interest in own way does not mean the pursuit of one's self-interest, selfish interest. And there's room enough for that, but there's also a room whereby for us to be other regarding in our actions, and that is particularly true in our neighborhoods and communities, as Smith develops it in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but it's also true in the Wealth of Nations. And passages in the Theory of Moral Sentiments sort of prepare you for that. And because he talks about every person should feel free to strain every muscle and every nerve to excel and do well in whatever he or she does. But never would one interfere with the similar pursuits of others, and that people by and large accept that notion that there are restraints on the extent to which you can interfere in your own interest in the pursuit of actions by others. So it's, and then Adam Smith, in developing his theory of society, makes reference to the existence of two and only two pillars or foundations of that side, of society. And one of those foundations he refers to as beneficence, the other to justice. So beneficence and justice in Adam Smith's thinking essentially exhausts the set of conditions under which we express our human sociality. And now, beneficence is about the good thing we do for each other in our neighborhoods and communities. Justice is about the control, the discouraging, the disincentivizing of the bad things we do to each other in our neighborhoods and communities. And he has in mind here great evils, particularly beginning with murder, and then proceeding to less serious, hurtful actions like theft and robbery, and also violation of contract. And in fact, in this, he kind of defines property. Property in the sense that, you see, if there's no control of murder, then we cannot have property in our bodies. If there isn't control and discouragement of theft and robbery, we can't have property in the products of our body. And unless there's some restrictions on violation of contract, we can't have property in each other's promises. So the promises we make to each other are importantly supported by, I believe, a property interpretation of what Adam Smith is talking about here in the theory of moral sentiments. Now, Smith's first proposition on beneficence goes as follows. And I want you to notice the general features of this proposition. It has many variables that are moving parts that can take on different values. So it's quite general and yet quite general, but yet limited in its application to the beneficial things that people can do for each other. So the proposition goes something like this. I'm going from memory here, so it may not be perfect. He says that actions of a beneficent tendency, which are properly motivated, alone deserve reward because of the gratitude felt by the observer. He uses here impartial spectator, but think of that as the impartial spectator as first an observer, and then primarily one that is not biased, okay, and that is impartial. And now that proposition, you see, explains why in English we have this phrase, debt of gratitude. If someone does something that's very helpful to you, and he does it out of the goodness of his or her heart. Your car is stuck in the snow in your driveway and you can't get it out. Your neighbor comes over and helps you extricate that car from the snow and get out on the road. You wouldn't have been able to get to work on time if that friend hadn't, or that neighbor hadn't helped you. So these actions we think of as, Smith thinks of, coming from companions that may be friends or acquaintances, but sometimes they come from strangers. An example of that might be where in ancient times people attended fairs and celebrations. Among American native peoples, they were known as powwows, big celebrations where tribal groups come together. And these were opportunities to also to trade and to exchange sort of cultural niceties. Well, that proposition, you see, covers sort of the note, or expresses the idea that we often feel a compulsion to reward a good action by another. That person might be the beneficiary of prosperous events, of good things that had nothing to do with us. And we like that, but that doesn't really discharge our sense of obligation for returning the specific favor that person did to us. Later in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, this is in the revisions of the 6th edition in 1790. Originally written in 1759, the 6th and final edition was finished in 1790, shortly before he died. There in summarizing that earlier work, he says, who of all people should we be kind to? He says it's those who have been kind to us in the past. So he is specifically here using that proposition to derive the notion of reciprocity in our social groupings, which is essentially a pre-economic trading system, which actually contain prices implicitly, because the favor you do for a friend in return for what that person did to you is proportional to the benefit and to the gratitude, and also to the gratitude felt. So reward is proportion to gratitude, is proportion to benefit received. So this idea of these variables being functions of each other, you see appear in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. By the way, Adam Smith studied mathematics at Glasgow, and in fact, when he went to Oxford, might have continued those studies, but he went to Oxford at a particularly dark time in the history of Oxford, and and so he didn't really have. It was a time when, as people said, the scholars were neither lecturing nor advising students, and so he was largely on his own. But he did very well in the great library there, which was to him a tremendous store of value. So, and then, interesting, what I call his second proposition on beneficence. Adam Smith points out that beneficence is always free. It cannot be coerced. And therefore, failure to be beneficent does no real positive evil. And it's not something people feel compelled to punish. So although I may punish an act of injustice due to me, I don't punish an action in which you fail simply to provide a benefit. Well, I think I think I'll sort of rest with that brief presentation. It seems to me that these are the essential elements in the theory of moral sentiments, and to some extent in his lectures on jurisprudence, which define his theory of society, which I think is unique, fresh, and highly relevant to the world today, because it involves this different way of thinking that is a non-utilitarian way of thinking about the origins of human sociality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for your wonderful talk. Yes, probably some questions from the audience, first of all. No? Okay. Yes, I have. We have a question in our chat. Yes, question for Professor Smith: is your mechanism of public goods decision in modern digital society more possible? Yes.
Well, you see, Smith he's talking about public goods, which they become public goods because of a common set of rules we tend to follow to contribute to the benefit of others, or to discipline the hurtful actions of others by punishing and disincentivizing them. So this is a public good that comes out of the actions of individuals who may act independently, but out of a great deal of respect and coordination with others, because he sees that as our nature. And I think it's instructive here to read the passages in the lectures on jurisprudence, in which he points out that in early societies where governments were weak, the authorities were very concerned to follow the norms and rules that people followed in the society. So that if your son murdered my son and the authorities apprehended your son, that person was brought to me and to my family to judge what was to be done. In other words, the victims of hurtful actions had a prominent part in determining what was to be done with the perpetrator. And in fact, I and my family may decide not to put the son down at all. In fact, there may be a form of victim compensation in which your family transfers resources, assets, or perhaps labor, a period of work to my family, and that serves to punish you, but also to compensate me and my family for our loss. And as Smith notes, in the modern state, where hurtful actions are interpreted as crimes against the public and are punished, you lose that victim compensation component.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Smith. Yes, probably I will ask several questions. Professor Smith, I wonder the following. What do you think about such a rapidly developing field as complexity economics? And how does this field relate to experimental economics? This is the first question. And the second one is, what is your attitude to heterodox economics, and probably what schools could be classified under this category? Thank you.
Well, I think, of course, experimental economics for me began with a study of markets. And the first experiments were actually very closely related to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, Chapter 7. If you read Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Wealth of Nations, Smith describes the interaction of buyers and sellers in a market that determines prices. And it's clear that he thinks about buyers and sellers acting in a way in which we today would think of as a process of price discovery. And I think that is very different than the modern utilitarian approach to markets, beginning with Cournot and then later the marginal revolution of the 1870s. And the dominant theme that sort of developed out of neoclassical marginal utility theory was the idea that demand is defined by utility maximization over quantities of goods as functions of their prices. And so that's a model in which, given prices, we maximize utility subject to a wealth or income constraint, and that determines demand quantities as a function of price. Well, that process, since it begins with the notion that prices and income are given, it can hardly serve as a mechanism for discovering prices. The classical economists, in contrast, and you particularly find this in Adam Smith, modeled buyers as coming to market with a maximum willingness to pay for desired units of goods. And this is also, interestingly, exactly the way Marshall does it in 1890, and also it's the same as in Bobbert. And their descriptions, Bombauer of Menger's horse market, Marshall's description of price formation in a country foreign exchange. These are elaborations of Adam Smith's Chapter 7, Book 1 of the Wealth of Nations. It's about how buyers and sellers, given the information and the knowledge they have, which is limited, interact in some sort of a negotiation process, a bid-ask process, and that's exactly what you see in Bombauer and Marshall, out of which prices come. And so the interesting implication of this is that demand as a function of price is something that people leave the market with. They don't go into the market with that. So the classics, you see, had a model of price discovery that explained what the neoclassicals came up with in the form of demand functions. And this had, of course, a supply counterpart in terms of the seeking of profit by firms. So that is the first thing I would say about Adam Smith, and I really want to emphasize that that's fresh and very relevant to modern scholars because we have the way of thinking, which is not part of the normal approach that we take. The normal approach is that A is chosen over B if and only if the utility of A is greater than the utility of B. Well, it's the only if part of that is challenged by Smith because he has an alternative a non-utilitarian approach to explaining human action and its origins. And he distinguishes carefully between the origins of action and the consequences of action, which tends not to be common in the way we theorize today. And, well, with regard to heterodox approaches to economics, I think Adam Smith is a great example in the sense that he comes to grips with virtually all of the modern issues with a way of thinking and a way of modeling that is distinct from a way that we tend to do it today. Now, I didn't know it, but my first experiments were really testing propositions in Chapter 7 of the Wealth of Nations. I never made that connection until many years later. I was more influenced by Marshall, but of course, a lot of those ideas in Adam Smith were coming through Marshall to me. Well, those early exercises in studying market price formation that I engaged in, which were very surprising. It was completely contradicted everything we thought we knew. Because I was brought up to believe that in order to achieve supply and demand and price equilibrium in a market, people would have to have complete information on supply and demand. Everybody would have to have a very large number of participants who in effect had little influence on price. Well, of course, Adam Smith's model of price formation is the opposite of that. Everybody has some influence on price, and that's the resolution of that conflict that is important in the price determining process. And of course, that was clearly confirmed in those earliest experiments. Now, we went on from those early experiments to very complex systems. We modeled in the laboratory price formation through bid-ask processes in, for example, in pipeline and gas pipeline networks. We eventually extended that to electric power markets, which are considered an extremely complex form of allocation. And the worldwide sort of deregulation movement, which actually had very little effect on the United States because we had been rate of return regulation had been was very hard for the deregulation movement to penetrate the deregulation or the regulatory apparatus that had been created in the United States. And the reason was very simple, that the companies all liked it. They liked regulation. They didn't want to give it up. It was to their advantage. They were assured profits, and it minimized their risk. So, and that's really why the worldwide deregulation movement that impacted the nationalization of electric power systems and tended to change that. It never penetrated very far into the U.S. networks, to some extent in wholesale markets, but certainly not at the level of consumer retail markets. Well, these are examples of complex systems that we eventually addressed in the laboratory. And of course, Adam Smith was talking about a complex system that drew on its roots in individual humans who were highly socialized and therefore, in that sense, connected closely with each other. All right, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Smith. Yes, probably some more questions, no? Professor Smith, yes, so once again, many thanks for your detailed answers, for your wonderful talk. It's really a great honor for us to see you here. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, and now I think we'll give floor to Professor Waterman. Yes, Professor Waterman, you're welcome. Please, do you hear us? Professor Waterman, please switch on your microphone. Your microphone is off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, right.
Yes, we hear you.
What do you want me to say something?
As you wish, of course, but probably if you have some slides, they might be instructive, yes, and it will be easier to follow you.
Say that again, please.
Yes, you could share your screen.
Share. What do I do? Share it. I can see you and you can see me?
Yes, I can see you and you can see me. It's right. But probably you have some slides, or you can do it without.
What do I have to do? I'm sorry.
I mean, probably you have some PowerPoint presentation.
No.
No, okay.
No.
That's okay. Yes.
No, I told you I wasn't going to talk very much.
Yes.
I have a very small point to make, and I have sent you a handout on it, and I was expecting other people to comment on what I sent.
Yes, I have distributed the article. Yes.
Okay, then I'll say briefly what it is I have to report about. Professor Samuelson, who I had the great good fortune to be a friend of, produced a paper some years ago on Adam Smith's economic theory, economic analysis. It was based on the assumption, his vindication of Adam Smith as a theorist, right? Samuelson's vindication of Smith as a theorist. And it was based upon the assumption that diminishing returns will bring all prices into, and the system into a stationary state, in which the natural wage is Malthus's subsistence wage, which is what Ricardo regarded as the natural wage. Now, that Samuelson's vindication, though, rested upon the assumption of constant returns to scale. But diminishing returns in a system of CRS. But if diminishing returns may be supposed to have been integrated into Smith's analysis, their effect, I think, is countered by the division of labor, which is explicit in Wealth of Nations, and which is may be conceived to imply increasing returns to scale. So my simple point is this: if in fact Adam Smith's conception of division of labor does imply increasing returns to scale, then that completely subverts the economic model we can get out of Wealth of Nations, because that does require at least constant returns to scale. Why? Because the price system, the price mechanism in Wealth of Nations is in fact determined as the dynamic equilibrium prices of growth rates of capital, labor, and so on. So if we have increasing returns to scale, then these things should be rising continuously, the economic growth. So since the price theory of Wealth of Nations rests upon the assumption that the natural price of labor is determined at any steady state of balanced growth, there would seem to be an irreconcilable contradiction between Smith's exposition of the division of labor in Book 1, chapters 1 to 3, and his price theory as set out in Book 1, chapters 6 to 9. So that's my point. In other words, putting it crudely, the economic analysis in Wealth of Nations is incoherent or self-contradictory.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Waterman. Yes, it's really very interesting point, but okay, since economic analysis in Wealth of Nations is incoherent, what's the value of the Wealth of Nations? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Why it's useful for nowadays, for example, why we are still studying it. Yes, if economists really respect Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations is a truly masterpiece, yes, but if economic analysis in the Wealth of Nations is incoherent, why we are still studying it?
Well, you see, I'm an historian of economic thought. My professional interest is discovering what economists in the past said and did and wrote, and why they did it, and what happened subsequently. In particular, I'm interested in what you might call classical political economy, the political economy of the people who describe themselves as followers of Adam Smith, chiefly Malthus, Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill, because out of classical political economy comes modern economic analysis, the kind of thing we teach undergraduates in university. So if we're going to regard Smith as the founder of the English school, then we have a problem here, because in fact what he maintained, or what he proposed in the Wealth of Nations, it implies this contradiction between, on the one hand, the assumption of increasing returns to scale, and on the other hand, the assumption of stable prices.
I see. Thank you.
So it's a purely academic point, but this, after all, is an academic conference, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Waterman. Yes, probably. Yes, we have one more question. Alexander Alexandrovich, probably. Please come closer. Yes. Give you a microphone.
Thank you. On the one hand, it seems that there is a real contradiction between these two approaches discovered in different parts of Wealth of Nations, and you really emphasized this problem. However, it seems that it is not the first time that we face this difference in the approaches, for example, when we try to compare microeconomic and macroeconomic approaches. Do not you think that probably the coexistence of these the parallel coexistence of these two approaches in different parts of Wealth of Nations probably is not a big problem if we think of it as of two, say, different branches of Adam Smith's theory, more macroeconomic and more microeconomic. So don't you think that these two approaches are able to coexist in the same book, probably if they shed light on different aspects of economic theory?
Well, yes, and that's a nice idea, but I want to point out that Samuelson's, by the starting point of my own investigation was Samuelson's vindication of Adam Smith as a theorist. A very elaborate, complicated model, which makes use of dynamic programming and goodness knows what, but which rested upon the assumption of diminishing returns, which would produce which would at equilibrium bring the system to stationary state. So Sam, I felt that Samuelson's vindication was not successful. I should say that I was in communication with Samuelson about this. He and I corresponded on a number of things, and unfortunately, his health began to decline, and after a certain point, unfortunately, our correspondence was ended by his death. But up to as long as he was, able to respond, we did correspond, and he didn't concede my point, but he didn't defeat it either.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Waterman. Probably some more questions? No? Okay, Professor Waterman, Professor Smith, many thanks for your being here. It's really a great honor and privilege. Many thanks, yes, dear colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.